Hello, and welcome to today's live chapter reading of Notebook Mysteries, Emma, written by Kimberly Mullins, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Where to start? The narrator thought as she sat drumming her right fingers against her lips. Where to start? She thought again, glancing around the brightly lit room looking for inspiration. The room she chose to start her writing project was in the attic space of the old Victorian she and her family called home. The house faced east. The room's dormers caught the bright morning light, and it washed across the writing desk where she sat. She chose the early morning hours to work on her book because she liked the feel of the sun on her face and the peace it gave her. The room was large and furnished with an old dark brown leather chair stationed next to a lighter brown antique desk on the east wall. Located across the room from the desk was a tall white dresser with brass handles, two white iron twin beds covered with patchwork quilts and aged lace throws. The floor was whitewashed, and a large, colorful area rug lay under the beds. It was a place where she could be away from the noise within the house. Her family was usually in high spirits about something or another and could be quite loud. Family, she thought, with an exasperated shake of her head. I'll have to get to them soon enough. She moved her hand from her lips to where the pencil laid on the desk, absently rolling it back and forth while she continued to concentrate on her book plans. A shuffling of shoes on the steps caught her attention, and her mouth quirked up in a quick smile. She looked toward the door and saw her dear one walking into the room. Dear One was a tall, slim man, so tall that he had to duck under the doorway to enter the attic. He wore his usual brown suit with a pressed shirt and vest. His face rested in an absent-minded expression as he carried a battered brown box under his left arm and, of course, an open book in his right hand. He dropped the box onto her desk, startling her, and then settled himself into the leather chair nearest her. He relaxed back, put his feet up on the edge of the desk, and continued to read. He hadn't glanced at her the entire time, but that wasn't unusual. He didn't look up until she tapped his battered brown leather shoe. Where should I start? She inquired, tilting her head toward her writing paper and typewriter. The reader of this might wonder why the narrator chose not to inquire about the box. Well, Dear One was always moving things about and working on projects. It got tiresome asking what was in one box or another, so she just nudged it out of the way. He acknowledged the question by lowering his book, brushing a thick brown curl back off his forehead, and then, finally meeting her eyes with his, stated rather brusquely, Well, at the beginning, of course, where it all started. She glanced down at her desk again, nudging the brown box so she could glance at her notes. The beginning, she thought. She reflected on how life as an investigator had begun. The long and varied career with many highs and lows that affected everyone who came into contact with it. She did not know it would eventually lead to this point in writing a book, but she wouldn't have changed it for the world. But the details of it, how to remember everything, she fretted out loud. Dear One didn't look up from his reading this time when he said, Look in the box. Something in there might help. She didn't notice a sparkle in his eye as he kept them averted toward his book. She glanced at him suspiciously, stood up, and folded back the lid. She realized what was in it almost immediately and knocked the heavy desk chair back as she moved closer. She sighed into a long smile looking at him. She said, The notebooks, where did you find them? He glanced up and with a smile said, I had them put away. I thought you might want to keep them to look at one day. Her eyes filled with tears as memories began flooding her senses. She pushed back the tears and said, with a deep breath, started pulling items from the box. And she kept removing notebooks. She was taken aback by the sheer number of them. They were small black scribble books that fit easily into a pocket, full of years' worth of data, detailing the life of an adventurer. So many, she murmured, so many adventures. Dear One agreed quietly. A lifetime's worth, to be sure. He had suggested the beginning. I might as well start there, she thought. She dug until she found the oldest notebook and the earliest case. The black leather crumbled a bit as she handled it, but the papers inside were not damaged. She took one in her hand. I'll call it case number 1, the office. Here interrupted again to say, Love, there is another case to discuss, a very important one. He reminded her it should be the first one. She knew the case of which he spoke and finally agreed with a nod of her head. Yes, you are quite right. I should start there. She started organizing the notebooks into piles, stacked by date, though for this case she could almost go from memory. She opened that first notebook and saw the title. She picked up her pencil to start the work. Chapter 1. 1871, Chicago, late night. Wake up, Dora, sister, Papa said as he nudged their shoulders. He reached over to turn up the gas lamp above the side table. The two girls had been asleep for hours and were groggy. Dora yawned as she opened her eyes and saw Papa standing over them. Intuitively, she knew something wasn't right and immediately asked, Papa, what's wrong? Sister woke up, rubbing her sleep-filled eyes, laid silent and watchful. She was waiting to hear how Papa would answer Dora's question. No questions now. You must get dressed, he said as he handed each of the girls their dresses and sat on the edge of the bed. The girls quickly scooted to the side where Papa was sitting, and they started pulling their dresses over their night shifts. He knelt in front of them to help each button the front of the dresses. They watched Papa silently and noticed his hands shaking. His hands never shook. Sister's hand reached out for Dora's. They held tight to each other, staying silent, waiting for Papa's next direction. Dora and Sister were little girls of 8 and 6 and would do anything their beloved Papa asked of them. It was very dark and quiet in the house as their Papa gathered them together to walk downstairs. Holding each other's hands, the girls followed him down the staircase to the first floor. As they moved closer to the front door, they became aware of the noise outside. Papa turned to the girls and squatted down in front of them, taking each of their small hands in his, and said gently, Girls, you must listen to me. Something is happening outside. We are going to go out, but I need you to stay on the stoop and be as quiet as possible. Can you do that? He didn't wait for an answer as he handed them their shoes. Dora, put on your shoes and help Sister with hers. Yes, Papa, Dora said as she sat down to slip on her shoes and help Sister with hers. As they sat waiting for Papa to take them outside, Dora just couldn't stop herself from asking, Papa, what is happening? She started to look around the foyer, feeling something or someone was missing. She realized Mama was not there. Papa, where is Mama? Sister continued to let Dora speak for her as she sat there holding onto Dora's hand. Papa, not wanting to answer a question he did not know the answer to, went silent for a long moment in the dark house. He stood up without answering and went to the door. He just couldn't make himself open it. He felt somehow that the motion of opening the door would force him to admit something he didn't want to happen had happened. He reached out hesitantly toward the brass doorknob and finally opened it. He turned back to the girls, took their hands in his, and brought them out onto the stoop. They stayed together holding hands with Dora leaning against Papa's leg. Chaos greeted them as they stood and stared out. Their senses were overwhelmed with the sounds of distress coming from neighbors, friends, and family scattered throughout the street. There was the smell of smoke in the air, and the general disorder of the people lent an almost surreal look to the night. It appeared that all the neighbors had come outside in a hurry, and most were still in their night clothes. If it wasn't scary, it would be funny. Even Mr. Smith, the local preacher, who normally was very dignified, with nary a hair out of place, was in the streets in a long dressing gown and a stocking cap that barely contained his wiry black hair. People continued to flood into the streets from the surrounding houses. Fire! Shouted someone, and a constant cry of, the fire will get us all! Came from the crowds that had formed. The crowds could smell the smoke and see the flames as the fire spread through the city and above the building tops. The fire was actually at a greater distance from their neighborhood than it appeared, but the panic-stricken people couldn't process that fact. Dora, not sure what would happen next, sat down on the top step of the stoop and started to cry in response to all the confusion, saying quietly, I want Mama. Sister continued to stand next to Dora, quietly patting her head and silently taking in the confusion that surrounded them. Papa, who had not moved from the stoop since exiting the house, seemed to visibly shake off the feeling of unease that gripped him. He gathered up his thoughts and spoke loudly and directly to the crowd gathered in the street around him. Friends, neighbors, and family, he nodded to each group. Please be aware the wind direction doesn't appear to be driving the fire this way, he said in a calm but stern voice. We must stay calm and keep watch on any changes in wind patterns. Those with small children, please return to your homes. Those who can help will need to start forming groups to organize shelter and food for survivors. If you can help, please join me over by my stoop. That statement and his apparent leadership calmed the people down. It gave them purpose and direction. The groups started to disperse, and families with small children went into their homes. As the volunteers came to the stoop to help, Papa assigned group leaders and started them working on compiling lists of available food, resources, and shelter locations. Papa went to where his girls were still sitting quietly. He sat between them, pulling each of them close to him, and said softly, It will make me happy if you would go to Uncle Hans's house to get some rest. Dora looked up from Papa's chest with tear-drenched eyes and asked one last time, Papa, where is Mama? Papa could never lie to his girls, and this time Papa did not evade the question. I think she might have gotten trapped by the fire at or around the bakery. We do not know more than that, he said honestly, trying to hold things together for his girls. Sister watched his face and seemed satisfied. Dora's eyes threatened to overflow with tears, but she held them back as she said, Yes, Papa, we will go to Uncle Hans's house. Papa motioned to Frederick to come up on the stoop for the girls. Frederick was the oldest son of Hans and the oldest cousin in the family. He was a very nice-looking, slim young man with thick brown hair and a lovely smile. Papa was happy to see that Frederick was already teasing smiles out of his younger cousins as he moved them to his house to get some rest. Mama's brothers, Hans, Paul, Ernest, and Otto, approached Papa about sending a small group of 2 into the area where Mama's bakery was located. Papa agreed and started to shrug into his jacket in preparation to leave with them. Otto stopped him by placing a hand on his arm and said to Papa in a rumbling German voice, Ellis, it is best for Sister and Dora that you remain here. Hans agreed and added, Also, the neighborhood will be looking to you for direction. Papa wanted to argue, but he looked around at the people still in the streets, and then his gaze went to Hans's house. He knew they were right, and he reluctantly agreed to wait. They all agreed that Paul and Otto would head out toward the business district and hopefully to Mama. It was hours later when the brothers came back. They were sweaty and covered in soot. The 2 brothers that had stayed behind ran up to them with water and wet rags. The 4 brothers hugged each other, glad they were back together. Paul and Otto took the water and wet rags gladly. The night was hot and the fire had made it almost unbearable. Otto sighed. Knowing he could not delay any longer, he said, Let's find Ellis. The brothers nodded at each other and looked for Papa. He was directing survivors into the established shelters when he spotted the 4 brothers coming toward him. He went quickly over to meet them. The first to speak was Otto. He looked Ellis directly in the eyes as he spoke. Ellis, the area is flooded with people that are evacuating. Paul and I could not get through, and we were advised by the Pinkerton detectives that the area will continue to burn overnight. This statement seemed to affect the brothers and Papa at the same time. The men all appeared defeated with their heads hung low. There's still a chance, Papa whispered brokenly. A chance she is among the evacuated or the injured. As Papa spoke, he glanced down at the shadowed street. The brothers made eye contact with each other and shook their heads silently. Paul and Otto had gotten close enough to the area to determine it was badly damaged by the fire and that very few people would be coming out alive. Papa wasn't ready to accept that Mama might have been taken from them. He looked searchingly in the direction of the bakery. He squinted his eyes, trying to see a greater distance. A familiar figure appeared to be coming toward them. No, he said, and shook his head to clear it. He looked again, and she was still there. He started smiling and broke away from the brothers at a run toward the image. Hans started to go after him, but Otto said no. Let him be. The brothers watched Papa, but did not interfere. He kept running to her image, but the closer he got, the more transparent she became. Finally, as he slowed down, he saw that she was smiling a sad smile and waving. Her image faded into the night before Papa could reach her. At that moment, Papa knew it had been Mama saying her last goodbye. The grief washed over him as he sank to his knees crying. Mama's brothers came to him, pulled him up, and hugged him close. Papa let his emotions take over for a few moments, and he cried into Otto's shoulder. The brothers watched with tears streaming down their faces. When Papa was calmer, he looked back at Hans's house. The girls, he said, as he straightened and pulled away from Otto, I must be here for them. The brothers nodded in agreement as they patted him on the shoulder and rubbed their own eyes. Mama would still be unaccounted for as the hours went by and the fire was slowly extinguished. Her normal working hours started at 3 a.m., but she had gone in early to prepare a special order that was to be picked up the next morning. The German pastry she was famous for was the chocolate leaves of Arbach, Earl poached pears, and grapefruit lemon quark mousse, which required hours of preparation and baking time. Papa kept muttering, that dessert, if she hadn't needed to be in extra early, she would still be alive. Dora and Sister heard Papa's comments that night. Both Dora and Sister would revisit that memory one day. The date was 1871, and the time was close to midnight. The news would filter in slowly through the rest of the night, with details about what and who had been lost. The fire spread quickly through the business area of Chicago, where the bakery was located. It was a fast and destructive fire because the building materials at the time were mostly wood, topped with highly flammable tar or shingle roofs. The city had also been in a drought condition that allowed the city to burn for 3 long days. The flying embers scared the residents into believing that they were at risk of losing everything. The fire would eventually destroy approximately 2.2 square miles, displacing 100,000 people and killing 300. Papa had been right about people needing help and needing everyone to provide a helping hand. Many people without homes would take shelter in parts of the city where the fire had not taken hold. Their fears had been rationalized or realized. Mama was one of the 300 that had perished in the fire. The girls stayed with their aunts, uncles, and cousins while Papa and Mama's 4 brothers made their way through the barricades that were set up by the Pinkerton detectives to protect residents from the still burning city. They wetted blankets in horse troughs on the way to the area and draped them over their shoulders. They were able to make their way through the still smoldering buildings to reach Mama's bakery. The men did not see the absolute destruction of the business district. They had a purpose to find Mama. As they entered the structure that used to be the bakery, they saw that the front area, where customers would buy from display cases, did not survive the fire. The walls were gone and the cabinets were reduced to black rubble. They entered the kitchen and were surprised to find it largely intact due to the stone walls and cement floor Papa had required them to have. Still not enough to protect her, thought Papa. Not enough. I'll have to do better. Mama's blonde hair was seen first by Hans. Here, she is here, he called out. Her appearance was a surprise. She had not been burnt at all. For a moment, it gave the brothers hope that she still might be alive. Papa knew that she was not. In later visits, Papa would notice the structural concerns that led to Mama's death. For now, though, his only thoughts were to retrieve her. She was lodged under a large support beam that had fallen from the ceiling of the kitchen. Papa pushed the emotion back and helped Mama's brothers work throughout the morning to dig her body out. None of the brothers or Papa spoke while trying to free her. The men burned their hands, paying little attention as they removed the beam. Once her body was uncovered, they stood in silent prayer before moving her. They placed a white sheet over her, crossed themselves, whispered their final prayers, and carried her back to her home. Notifications were made to the police, but there was no investigation. The cause of death was listed as an accidental death due to the fire. Additionally, they reported there was one staff member that had gone missing. He was a kitchen helper that was always by Mama's side. The police presumed him dead when a body could not be located. There wasn't time to grieve. Due to all the cleanup and work of rebuilding, Papa sat down and spoke honestly to Sister and Dora about what had happened to Mama. While they moved forward and stayed busy, Dora seemed the most affected by the tragic event, and Papa could hear her crying at night. He did what he could to help the girls, all the while thinking that if Mary hadn't had that special order, she would have been safe with them. Sister, Dora, and Papa were surrounded by Mama's family, friends, and customers at the funeral. Everyone seemed to be wearing black, mourning the dead, and trying to figure out how to move forward. It was a dark and grim period of Chicago's history. Time would start to heal wounds, and life would start to move forward again quickly. The family agreed that Frederick, also known as Cousin, had the drive and talent to run the bakery business. The family pitched in with labor, materials, and time to get it going again. They renamed the bakery Cousins with Ellis's approval. Until the bakery was functional again, Cousin and other family members would work out of the kitchen in Dora and Emma's house. There, they would watch the girls, keep the family together, and keep the bakery going. Mama had already started training both of them, so they were helpful to Cousin and would continue learning at the same time. As the cleanup began, so did the plans for the rebuild of the great city. Chicago would rebuild while the bricks were still smoking. Nothing would hold the people back from the rebuilding. Papa, a structural engineer by trade, would also help to lead investigations into the fire. He would help to determine that one of the root causes was that the city was at risk from fires due to the current building codes. Added to that was the lack of fire water available to firefighters. Papa would be at the forefront of new codes and building standards for Chicago and would be in demand from other cities to help with their codes. Chicago would rise out of the ashes, moving forward at a fast pace, but with a safe design.